What's up? Welcome back. You're watching part 4 in a series where we're building out a short-term vacation rental marketplace. And in the very first episode that we put out, the intro, we got some really good feedback and ideas about different things that we could add. And so in the comments, we saw asks for adding geolocation to your listings, for adding mapping system, being able to see on a map where all the listings are. We also had ideas around adding reviews so that a guest could review a host and a host could review a guest. So we'll talk about adding all of that stuff. But what I wanted to do today, and in this episode, is we'll go through adding place autocomplete. So we're going to use the Google Maps API here. I pulled up the documentation for the autocomplete place thing where you can sort of just type in an address, and using the Google Maps API, it'll autocomplete the address so that you have a real address. But what's beautiful about this is you also get the geometry. So you're also going to get the latitude and longitude for where that property is listed. So this is gonna sort of act as our geolocation, and we're gonna continue. This is sort of part also of creating the listing. So we're just creating the address for the listing here. Okay, so let's dive in and talk about how we might implement this. So in order to use this Google Maps JavaScript tool on the client, we need to write a little bit of JavaScript. And what we could do is just write some inline JavaScript that did a bunch of this stuff, right? So we're gonna create an autocomplete field, and then we'll use document.querySelector to just update a bunch of content on the page. But what I think the more Railsy thing to do in this case in particular is to add some Stimulus.js. So Stimulus is a really thin JavaScript library that adds some really basic stuff to the front end that we can use when we want to add a little bit of JavaScript interactivity, but we don't necessarily need a full single page rendered app. So what I want to do is let's go through and sort of modify this demo or this example, and we'll use it with Stimulus. So maybe first step is to actually get started by installing Stimulus Rails. So you can say bundle add Stimulus Rails. And this will add the Stimulus Rails gem to our gem file, and it will also bundle install. I'm not using import map, or I think there's a couple other tools for setting up Stimulus. I think you can say Rails G Stimulus :install, and this should set up some basic stuff for getting Stimulus installed. Nope, I got that wrong. So Stimulus Rails. Let's see here. So, Rails Stimulus install. It's not a generator. So it's Rails Stimulus install. There's no G. Okay. So this created a directory for us called controllers. It also created an index, an application, and a hello controller. So let's jump in and take a look at what those give us. So under app JavaScripts, now we have controllers. And there's an inside of application. This is kind of doing the setup, I think, for the application in general. Then our hello controller is just an example controller. We're actually just going to delete that. And then we have this index, which is registering the hello controller. So we're going to actually create a brand new controller here, and let's call it address controller.js. And in here, we'll import controller from... can I import it directly from, yeah, okay, so hotwired, from hotwired Stimulus, and then we're going to say export default class extends controller, and inside of here is where we're actually going to define our controller. And now a Stimulus controller is a JavaScript object that's going to attach to some DOM element and basically just listen for events that are firing on the DOM element, and then allows you to sort of add a little bit of JavaScript interactivity to some object in the controller. So for now, let's just say connect. So connect. There's a couple different lifecycle methods. There's connect, initialization, disconnect. For now, we'll just say console.log address controller is connected, and we'll take a look and try to see when that happens. All right, so the next step that we need to do when we're installing Stimulus, if we don't have import map and some other things, is in our pack for application, we need to actually import controllers here. So at this point, we should have an address controller that when it's mounted or when it's connected to a DOM element, we should see this log statement happen. So if we pull up localhost 3000, okay, it's actually not even running. So let's start Rails server. And then we're also going to start our Webpack dev server in 2 separate tabs. I know I'm continuing to using Webpack. The industry hasn't necessarily settled on what the best, the industry has not settled on what the best build pack or whatever is going to be for Rails 7. So I'm kind of holding off to see how folks land on that. And then there's one other thing that I missed, and that is that inside of this index for controllers, I'm still importing hello controller instead of address controller. It turns out that this file is auto-generated, so you actually just copy this. You just like kind of copy this command here. So I'm going to grab this thing and then run that. And we're going to say reload that. And now we see address controller is being pulled in. And now that's what's registered. And now we see that our Webpack dev server is compiling successfully. So that's good. Now, if we go back to like host listing /new, right? What I want to do is add a new input field here for address. And when you type into that address, it should use the Google's address autocomplete. So what we want to do is let's go to listing new, to the listing new page here. And let's add a new label, and it's going to be for address. And inside of here, we're going to have an input box, and that's going to be of type text. The ID will be address so that our label selection works. And we'll have no value to start off. We actually want to turn autocomplete off here so that we're not using the browser's autocompletion. That will conflict with like the dropdown that's created by the Google Maps Places API thing. Now, when we're using the stimulus controller called address controller, what we want to do is we want to mount that onto some DOM element. Now, you might have a controller that's associated with your entire form, but in this case, I want to be able to potentially add autocomplete to other fields. So what I want to do is actually create just a div here, and we'll use this div as sort of the container for all of the address stuff that we want to do. And the way that we connect the address controller JavaScript file to this DOM element is we say data-controller. So we use these data-attributes. And here we just say address by convention. This is the name of the controller. So address is the same as this name of the stimulus controller. And by doing just this, by just adding data-controller, now when we reload our page, make this a little bigger, in the console, we should see that that address controller was connected. And we do. We see this log statement here, address controller is connected. That's because that connect method is fired when the stimulus controller is connected to that DOM element. So right now, if we look at this HTML, we see this div data controller address. So now this div and everything inside of it is associated with that address controller. So that's pretty cool. All right, so what we want to do is eventually inside of this controller, we're going to have methods for like init Google or something. And this is going to be to like set up autocomplete. And then we're also going to have a method that fires once like a place is selected, and that will like use the values from autocomplete to actually like do its thing. So in order to set all of this up, we need to use the Google Maps API. And so we want to add a JavaScript, like a script tag to our page that has our API key set up. But I wanted to walk through how you actually set that up in the Google Cloud Platform dashboard. So I've got clearbnb. This is kind of the project where we've already enabled the OAuth settings so that we can log in with Google. So I'm going to enable some more APIs and services here. And I want to search for all of the like maps, like JavaScript maps APIs, because we want to enable maps. Eventually, we're going to show maps. Right now, we're not actually showing them, but we want to enable maps for clearbnb. And we also want to enable the places API. So we'll enable that. And we also want to enable the geocoding API, I think. Yep, so we've got the geocoding API. I don't know the differences between the geocoding API and the geolocation API, but we'll just add, well, I'm gonna add them both right now. It doesn't, yeah, I don't think it hurts to add them as long as you're, oh, location data from cell towers. I actually don't need that. But all right, so this project is gonna have an API key that is associated with the, with all of these different APIs. And so we're gonna come into our credentials setting for the this Google Cloud platform. We're gonna say create credentials. We wanna create an API key. I'm gonna copy this API key. You don't have to copy it or look at it. I'm gonna roll the key after I record this. Then the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna go into our, so I'm gonna close that out so I can still roughly see the key here. We're gonna go into Rails credentials :edit. I've already got my API keys set up for OAuth with Google. So now I'm gonna say maps and drop in my API key there and then close that out so that my API keys are stored in my, my credentials. The next step is we want to drop that JavaScript tag on the page. So one thing that you might run into, and that I ran into when I was playing around with this, is that you need to have billing set up, and you also want to restrict your API key. So once you have your app published to a domain, you can restrict the API key so that only requests coming from your domain with that API key work, so that if someone takes your API key, they can't just drop it on their own website and use it. So this is helpful if you want to like control access to that API key. But I'm going to go roll those keys anyways, so you don't have to like, no need to copy that. The next thing is that you also need to have billing set up. So you get like $200 or something in free credits, which accounts to like 400,000 requests or something like that. I think for each 1,000 requests, it costs $5. So it's been more than enough to play around and experiment. So all right, so let's say we've got our geolocation API key set up. The next thing is we want to drop in this script tag. So I'm going to open up application HTML ERB. And at the very top of the page here, I'm just going to load Google Maps. And instead of placing this API key thing here, we want to actually use our rails.application.credentials.google maps. And that should be our maps API key. The other thing is that we want to set this script tag to load as async and defer. And we also want to set data turbo links something equals false. Data turbo links eval is false because we only want to load this JavaScript one time. As we're turbo linking around, we don't want to like switch to different stuff. Okay, so then the other piece of this is that in the query string for this JavaScript file, we want to tell the Google Maps JavaScript which JavaScript function we're going to expose that it can call when it's done loading. So we're going to say callback is equal to init map. This needs to be a globally available function called init map, or whatever you name your function that's on the window. That's what you want to pass in here as the callback. And this is kind of funky. Like the way that this actually works is kind of funky. So when the page first loads on the user's browser, it's going to download the JavaScript from Google. Google is going to execute all of its stuff to set things up, and then it's going to call your init, whatever your callback function is, and that's how you know that the Google JavaScript is set up and ready to go. So we actually need to go create some sort of global function that's going to be called when the Google Map thing is loaded. So I'm going to go into packs actually, and down here I'm just going to say window.init map is equal to some function that's going to be called, and we'll say console.log map initialized or something. I don't know. And then we will go back to our browser. And when we refresh the page, we're now seeing that the map is initialized. So our address controller is connected and the map is initialized. What's really cool is, okay, so it looks like maybe our key isn't being loaded. Okay, so you got to restart the server after you set up the credentials. So now our API key is in there and our map is initialized. So that's looking awesome. Once the map is initialized like this, you should have access to a global variable called Google. And this is going to be kind of your access into the Google Maps APIs here. And so there's a method that we can call, or we're going to initialize a new instance of this thing called Autocomplete. So we're going to say new Google Maps places Autocomplete. We're going to pass in an element that we want to mount this onto. And then we should sort of just get autocomplete out of the box, I think. So let's go over to our, okay, well, what's weird is that we have this init map function that we're calling at the window level, right? And we can see that the map is being initialized, but we don't know about that event and we don't know that Google is initialized inside of our addresses controller. So we need some way to sort of notify the address controller that this event is firing or that sort of Google is ready. And we can't really pass init Google, like the instance method from our address controller as the method that's called in the callback. So instead what we want to do is we're going to build a little bit of an interop. And this was inspired by Chris Oliver's Go Rails episode about using Stripe.js using Google Maps with Stimulus. And his idea was to fire an event here. So we create an event, const event is new event, and we're going to pass in whatever map loaded or something. And then we say event dot init event. And this is where we're like actually name the event that's going to fire. So we can say like map loaded. And then we can tell it that the event does bubble true. And then it also is cancelable true. And in order to broadcast this event globally, we're going to say window.dispatch event. I think this is how this works. Okay, cool. So then if we were to go back to our page here, this init or this map loaded event is going to be a new type of event, just like click and submit. And there's several different event types, right, that can fire. In our case, we're creating a brand new instance of an event called map loaded that's going to actually fire on the window level. And so using Stimulus, if we head back over to listing new, using Stimulus, we can actually register an action and listen for this global event that's going to fire on the window. And we can register that by saying data-action. And then we say the event type that's going to fire. So if this was going to be a click event, then we would say click, and then whatever, we would handle that click event. But because the event type here is map loaded, we're going to say map loaded, and that is on the window. So we're going to say when the map is loaded on the window, fire the instance method called init Google, and that instance method is on the address controller. It's kind of confusing. Like this action query language doesn't make a ton of sense to me, but this is kind of how we're doing it. So we're listening for the map loaded event to fire on the window. And when that happens, we are going to call. So I think this arrow function means call. And the function we're going to call is the init Google method on the address controller. And since we're inside of the address controller, we should be able to call that init Google function. So let's make sure that in our address controller, we have this init Google thing. We're going to say like console.log Google Maps is initialized and the address controller knows about it. Okay, so if we come back over here and refresh the page, now at the bottom in the console, we see the controller's initialized and the Google Maps is initialized and the address controller knows about it. Let's also console.log Google from here, just so that we can see that we are indeed getting like the full Google object. So this is just a global object that's now available on the window, and we happen to have it inside of our init Google method. And what we want to do here is set up that autocomplete function. So so far what we've done is we've set up Stimulus. We set up a little interop that says when the Google Maps JavaScript is loaded, we're going to fire this global event. And then we use Stimulus.js to wire up that global event and listen for it in our controller. And now what we need to do is use that new Google object to construct a brand new address map places autocomplete method on some element. that we want to use. So if we go back to listing new, right? Inside of here, what we really want to do is we want to use this input box as the autocomplete element. That's like the DOM element that we want to pass into that autocomplete thing. And so I think what we want to do here is actually give this another type of stimulus thing called data target. We're going to say data dash target or address target, and we're going to call this input. And then back in our controller, we need to specify several targets. So we're going to say static targets is equal to this list, where we're going to give it input as our first target. Now, Stimulus is doing a really cool thing here. They know that because we called this this attribute data dash and then the controller name dash target and gave it this name input, that it's going to create several different methods and references inside of the controller that we can use to access that DOM element that is a sub element of this whole controller. So this is really neat. Let's check this out. So what we can do now is when we're calling autocomplete, we're going to say this.input target. So the format here is something like this dot and then whatever the name of target is, and then with a capital T target. And there's also like targets, and there's also like has something with a capital name of target. So there's a couple different ways you can access those, but this should initialize autocomplete on that target. So let's see if that changes anything for us out of the box. Okay, so immediately we can see now that the placeholder is changed. Now it says enter location. And if we start typing 123 Main Street or something, right, then we can see that is auto-completing. So this is exactly what we wanted to happen. So we're seeing 123 Main Street, it's auto-completing. And then when we select it, ideally, recall that we want to like take all the different components for the address, including the lat and long, and we want to store those in the database with the listing. And so now we want to talk about the next step, which is like as you're actually, or after you finish typing in here, right, and you select something, we want to do something after that. And so what we want to do is actually store reference to this instance of autocomplete. So we're going to say this dot autocomplete is equal to this thing. And these autocomplete, like this instance of this autocomplete thing, you can tell it what fields you want. You can also do this in another method. You can say select fields. Let's do it this way. So we're going to pass in some options object into fields. I guess we also just want types. I don't want to restrict the component to certain countries because theoretically anyone could stay anywhere or something. We haven't actually like figured out if we want to be available in every country, but whatever. For now, we'll just remove that setting. And so when we initialize this, I think this should work, that we will get the address components back. We'll get the geometry, including lat and long, and we only want addresses. That will give us, that'll limit it, I think, so that we don't end up with like, I don't know, places like parks or something. I don't know. All right, and then what we can do is we can say this.autocomplete will fire an event called place changed. So we can say .listen to, no, add listener for place changed. And when the place changed event fires, we want to call some function. So let's actually call this.place selected, and that'll fire off this event, or like that'll call this method on the controller. And in order for us to contain or like maintain reference to this, we want to call .bind this, just so that we're actually calling place selected, and we'll continue to have reference to the same controller. Now inside of place selected, this is where we're hoping to do something from that autocomplete. And it turns out that we can actually get access to the place by saying like place is equal to this.autocomplete. I kind of wonder, like I was expecting that when the place changed event fired, that would actually be passed as an argument here, but it's not. You have to like use the reference of the autocomplete to get the place. The method is get place. And we'll just console.log the place, and that should give us like all the stuff that we asked for, I think. So here we will, invoking something, add listener is not a function, refresh, okay. Add listener, I spelled this wrong, add listener, okay. So now when we say 123 Main Street or something, now you can see that we're logging out the actual place, and this gives us the address components. So that has like the address number, the street name, the city, the county, which we don't actually care about, the state, and the country, and then like the zip code or the postal code. The postal code is actually broken into two different components, so this gives us like an even more narrow specific postal code. Super cool. But how do we actually get this back to our backend to update or while we're creating a listing? Well, the way that I think that makes the most sense to approach this is I'm actually going to just create a bunch of hidden inputs that are inside of this data controller DOM element. And when the place is selected, we'll just update all of the elements with whatever we got back. So if we go back to our HTML here, so we're going to have like a ton of elements. So we're going to say input type is hidden. We don't need names or values. What we do need is, we need name. And so the name is going to be what is passed back to the server. So listing, and this is going to be like address line 1, and the data address target. So again, this is going to be the way that we use Stimulus to target these hidden input elements. And we need to use this data-address-target and then specify what is the name for this target here. And so for line 1, we'll call it line 1. We'll have line 2, and then we'll have city. Okay, so these are all just a bunch of hidden inputs. We've got the name here. That's what's going to be passed to the server. We've got the data address targets. That's what is going to allow us to create targets back in our controller. So up here, we can now create like line 1. We can have line 2, city, state, postal code, and country. And now several new targets are going to be created for us for these. This is line 2, city, state, postal code, country. Okay, so now when the place is selected, we want to like iterate over the components and update those HTML elements. So in the documentation for Google or for this like Google Autocomplete thing, we have this fill in address bit where they walk you through how to actually get each component from the place details and then fill those in for like each address using either, street number, and you're going to concatenate them like this, and then the route, and you're going to concatenate it like this. So let's just copy this. Let's copy this whole thing here. And we're going to just kind of, we'll improve on this and make it our own. All right, so as we're iterating over each component of those address components, the very first thing here is dealing with the address. So the route and the street number are in separate, they're in separate components. So we need to sort of combine those. So I'm going to say this dot line 1 target dot value is equal to the component long name plus the this dot line 1 target dot value. So this is just kind of setting that the value for that hidden input for line 1 equal to the long name for the component. So this is going to be the street number plus whatever we already have. So that's in case we're iterating over the components and we encounter the route before the street number or something. And then otherwise, we're going to concatenate this dot line 1 target dot value with the short name. I wish they really just broke this up and made it easy so you could just say like, give me address line 1, 2, 3, city, state, zip, et cetera, et cetera. But I know that's not globally the same way that everything works. So instead, this is what we've got to work with. All right, so for postal code, here what we're going to do is say this dot postal underscore code target. This is a little odd when you first start out. When we have a target that has an underscore in it, that carries over. But if you have a dash, I think it ends up being camel case or something. But Either way, this is what we want to do is postal code target.value. And then here we're going to say this.postal code target.value. And I'm going to do the same thing here and here. So when you have a postal code, at least in the United States, the first part of it tells like where the box is or something, or like the sort of like town where the box is, the postal code. And then there's a suffix which tells like which specific box. And then like the number is like which number in the box kind of. I don't know. Yeah, it's postal code suffix is nice to have, especially if you're sending physical mailers. So we like to hang on to that. Locality, this is what we call city. So this dot city target dot value, and then state is going to be this dot state value dot or state target dot value, and then country is going to be this dot country target dot value. And I like to use the short name for country, so that it's just US or CA or MX or whatever instead of the whole written out country situation. And then long term, if you wanted to, you could build a lookup table and look up by the short name. All right, let's just see if this works. So now we've got these inputs down below. And as we type into our input box and select one, we expect, I don't know why we broke in the debugger there. We expect that it's going to be filled in here, and it totally is. Look at that. So we now have values for address line 1. Line 2, there is not actually line 2s here. Let's see. Like, I don't know. Wells, apartment. No. I don't know, whatever. We'll just leave line 2 out for now. But otherwise, we've got our address, city, state, postal code, and the country is populated. The two other things that we need is the latitude and longitude. So let's go add hidden inputs for those. So we're going to have a lat and a long, and this is going to be lat and long. And let's see here. So inside of our address controller, we need to add 2 new targets for lat and long. Okay. And then when our place is selected, we need to set the geometry. So if there's no geometry, then we're just going to return early. Otherwise, we're going to say this.lat_target.value is equal to place.geometry.location.lat. And for long, it's going to be the same thing, but lng. Okay, let's see if this works. So now if we pick a location, 1, 2, 3, whatever, and we don't get those values populated. Did we not? Refresh. Let's see. 23. East Brader. Okay, what's going on here? We've got an error. Oh, if there's no place.geometry. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Boom, go to elements. And look at that, we've got a lat and long dropped right in there. So that is amazing. Now what we want to do is be able to say create listing and have this populate our lat long and all of our address components. So it looks like we actually did get address line 1, but we did not get our latitude and longitude. So let's go let those also be passed in as arguments. So now we're going to go to the listings controller and add in here lat and long. I thought initially when we built this out, we might do the geocoding on the server, but now that we're using this sort of like address autocomplete thing, let's do this on the client. So we'll create another one here. This is going to be like test. Okay, we're going to put in some address here. We're going to say create listing. And now we have an address with the lat long inside of the listing. And so, yeah, that's how you can set up the autocomplete address feature. Let's just go really quickly as a quick recap. We'll go back through some of the pieces. So we need to accept address line 1 to city, state, zip, country, lat long on our listing create controller. We also need to go into our gem file to add this stimulus Rails gem, which we did. And this is for, that's so that we can use Stimulus.js. Then we went over to application pack or JavaScript into the packs application.js, and we imported controllers. And we also we ran Rails stimulus install to set up the stimulus controllers thing. Then we added this window init maps function that fired a custom event when the map was loaded. And from application HTML ERB, we installed the JavaScript tag for Google Maps that said as soon as the Google map is loaded with our API key that has billing enabled, we're going to call this callback function init map. That's going to trigger the event. And when that event fires, we are going to use our data action here on our controller for address. That's going to listen for that map loaded event on the window. And when it fires, it's going to call init Google on the address controller, which is going to register the autocomplete handler for this input here. And then as soon as a place is selected, it's going to populate the values for all of these inputs here. And so inside of our address controller, as soon as we init Google after the Google JavaScript is loaded, we create a new autocomplete function. And then we add a listener that says, as soon as the place is changed, fire our place selected method, which goes through and sets all the values for the components that were selected from the Google dropdown. So that's how we set up autocomplete. Thank you so much for watching. If you're enjoying this series, I would really appreciate a thumbs up, maybe even a subscribe if you're feeling generous. And yeah, hope everyone's having a great day. If you have any feature requests or things you want to see added to our short-term vacation rental platform, let me know down in the comments. And yeah, otherwise we'll see you in the next one.